What happens when a man survives decades of power struggles, leadership changes, and growing pressure from federal investigators? His name was Tony Accardo. For more than half a century, Accardo remained one of the most influential figures connected to the Chicago outfit. But his rise was not built overnight. Born in Chicago in 1906, Antonino Tony Accardo grew up in a city where organized crime was becoming increasingly influential. As a young man, he entered the world of the Chicago outfit and eventually came into the orbit of Al Capone. Accardo's career developed during one of the most turbulent periods in Chicago history. The Prohibition era brought competition between criminal groups, intense law enforcement attention, and constant struggles for influence. Accardo learned an important lesson early. Power was not only about taking control, it was about surviving change. After Capone's era came to an end, the Chicago outfit entered a new period. Accardo continued rising through its ranks. He became known as a trusted figure within the organization and developed relationships that would remain important for decades. But Chicago's power structure was never completely stable. Leadership changed, rivalries emerged, and federal investigators increasingly focused their attention on organized crime. Through these periods of uncertainty, Accardo remained remarkably resilient. By the 1950s, he had become one of the key figures in the Chicago outfit. He was associated with Sam Giancana, another major Chicago figure. Their relationship reflected a larger reality inside the organization. Power was shared, negotiated, and constantly reshaped. Then came another major turning point. As federal authorities increased their investigations into organized crime, the pressure on Chicago's leadership grew. Giancana eventually left the center of power. Accardo, meanwhile, moved toward a quieter role. Rather than seeking constant public attention, he became associated with a more discreet style of leadership. That approach helped distinguish him from some of the more publicly known figures of the era. For Accardo, staying out of the spotlight became part of the strategy. Investigators continued examining his activities and financial connections for years. Yet major legal challenges often proved difficult to turn into lasting convictions. By the 1960s and beyond, Accardo was no longer the young associate who had entered Chicago's underworld decades earlier. He had become one of its longest-lasting figures. His career had survived the rise and fall of Al Capone. It had survived internal power struggles. It had survived leadership changes. And it had continued despite decades of federal attention. Tony Accardo eventually stepped away from the public side of organized crime. He died in 1992 at the age of 86. His legacy remains controversial and deeply connected to the history of organized crime in 20th century Chicago. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his story is not how loudly he commanded attention. It is how long he remained relevant while doing the opposite. Tony Accardo built his reputation through patience, influence, and an ability to survive Chicago's changing power structure. And that is why his name continues to appear in the history of the Chicago outfit.